those other moments from our history when people rose up in protest of racism and unfair treatment, particularly from federal institutions, state institutions, city institutions, institutionalized racism. In 1968, when we go back 53 years, we saw civil unrest in our city that began in the Parkland neighborhood near the intersection of 28th and Greenwood. Many of our prominent citizens and civil rights champions took place in those marches, including Manfred Reed, Mattie Jones, Merv Aubusman, Ken Clay, and many others. And many of them were arrested for their involvement in those protests. And this all took place in a painful time in our country's civil rights history. Dr. King had been assassinated just a few weeks earlier, and this, of course, followed the civil unrest in our country, seen in Watts in 65, in Detroit, Newark, and New Jersey in 1967. And I think it's fair to say it's different, but the anger and pain that was on display then reverberates to this day, emphasizing the need to get it right this time, to do all we can to dismantle systemic racism and create a city of racial equity and justice, and to grow and heal together. And when I say all we can do, I mean, it is all of us together, but it's incumbent, obviously, on white America, white Kentucky, white Louisville. And so it's important as we plan the future of our city that we understand the connection between the civil unrest of 1968 and the civil unrest of 2020. Why? So we can break this pattern with hope for everybody and justice and equity for everybody. So we can learn the lessons, however painful, especially to white communities that are coming to grips with this, that we need to learn in order to move forward together. So we can prevent what James Baldwin once called the fire next time. So let me introduce our panelists. Betty BAYE, a longtime nationally acclaimed columnist at the Courier-Journal, researcher, interviewer for the University of Kentucky's Civil Rights Hall of Fame Oral History Project, and a member of the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame. Welcome, Betty. AUKRAM BURTON, a Louisville historian, and he's also executive director, Kentucky Center for African American Heritage, and fair to say, AUKRAM, a Renaissance man. And Dr. Ricky Jones, an award-winning columnist, a professor, and the graduate director and chair of the Pan-African Studies Department of the University of Louisville. And I think he went to Morehouse College. I'm not quite sure, but I believe that's where he graduated from. So welcome, Dr. Jones. Our title for this session, The Fire Next Time, comes from the powerful and best-selling book by James Baldwin from 1963. I'd like to read a quote from the book to get us started so you all can respond to the quote. And here we go. Quote from James Baldwin. I know what the world has done to my brother and how narrowly he has survived it. And I know, which is much worse, and this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. One can be, indeed, one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, for this is what most of mankind has been at since we have heard of man. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind, but it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. So Dr. Jones, if you'd kick us off and give us some reflections on that quote and the context of what we've been through in the last year in our city and in terms of demands for racial justice.
Yes. Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate you inviting me to hang out with you for a little while, talk about this important topic, certainly to the other two folk who I have known for a while and loved very, very deeply, to my dear brother, AUKRAM BURTON, who's done great work all over this country, always been true to trying to figure out paths to truth and decency and equality and racial reconciliation. AUKRAM, I love you, and I'm glad to have you with us tonight. And Betty BAYE, who I have known literally since the time that I came to Louisville, a New York girl who took an Atlanta boy in Kentucky and made me feel safe. I love you, Betty. If you wasn't in love with another man at that time, I would have tried to scoop you up and marry you myself. But, James Baldwin is one of my favorite writers. And he's always been one of my favorite writers because he is so incredibly incisive and brave. You know, a gay Black man living at a time when being homosexual and being Black were both considered marks of shame in this country. And Baldwin, even though he had to take some breaks, you know, and go abroad, he would always come home and he would always engage in that struggle. And so what Baldwin understood, as you know, AUKRAM and Betty understand, and I'm certainly sure that you do as well, Mayor, he understood the importance of the contextualization of history. If we simply talk about 1968 or the 1960s and then talk about the 2000s and we meet those in a vacuum, then we miss the point. Racial struggle has been a part of the American experience before America was even America, right? And Baldwin understood that. Baldwin understood that the country was built on a foundation of white supremacy, and we've yet to really reconcile that. And so when folks say, you know, I find a couple of things very interesting when people say we've never been as divided as we are now. That's not true. We've always been divided along lines of race. And when people say, oh, we have to come together, we need to come together around what? There is no way we can come together in this country ever, at least not in a healthy way, if we don't come together around some type of truth. Only then can we reconcile and build something more just, true, and humane. And so Baldwin understood that. And so it's not just the fire next time, it's the fire the time after that, and after that, and after that, if we don't come to grips with that. So I encourage anybody watching this, if they have not actually read Baldwin, to engage in that reading and, you know, sit with that. Take a nice drink of bourbon and sit with some Baldwin for a while, and then expand to the tributaries that Baldwin will lead you to. So I think Baldwin is a great place to start.
Betty BAYE.
Well, you know, I think it's interesting that we're having this conversation, and I think it's the very day that Malcolm X was killed. In New York City, part of a...
2 days ago, Betty, 2 days ago.
2 days ago. I remember the day, I remember where I was. I remember rushing into my mother's house, telling her that Malcolm had been shot because she wanted to see him. And I took her to see him up on 116th Street. He was up on a ladder and he was talking, and Mom wanted to see him. Now, she wasn't going to leave the church for the Nation of Islam, but she sure liked what he was saying. And I keep wondering why it is that we don't learn, because what I keep seeing is that every decade or so, or every generation, so there's this eruption of white rage, and it just erupts, and it's sort of like, you know, you say you're making progress, and then there's I was looking at the Smithsonian thing about, you know, 1919, what all the blood that was shed in 1919 in Tulsa, in 1920, you know, all of the race riots around the country where Black people were being attacked and killed. And it's like we keep repeating this cycle. And then we had January 6th of this year, when we saw what they're calling an insurrection, a riot, you know, at the very capital of the United States. And I say to myself, at this point, I think the ignorance is willful. It is willful ignorance, because there's no shortage of, I mean, I think when I was coming along, it was a little harder to find the books, the literature, the information that you need. But now, I mean, they have books now about being anti-racist, about what's going on in the country. They're selling them at Sam's Club, you know, at Costco. There is you don't have to even go all the way to the local library. You can get online. So, you know, I just about the innocence. I think that white America just shields itself in this innocence about who it is. And I even hear Black people say, this is not who we are. Yes, it is. It's who we've been. And again, it is African Americans who keep trying to save America from itself. I mean, even after we are the ones who are lynched and all of that, we still talk about those ideals in a real way that we think we can make it happen. So to me, when I think about the fire next time, it's been a fire my whole life. I've been here 7 decades now. It's been a fire. And it's like our house is burning down, and we still elect people who are reprobates. We elect people who have no understanding, because we still believe that somebody has to keep somebody down. So if you keep Black people down, that's going to elevate you. You know, and is it Lyndon Johnson who had that expression about if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the highest black man, then you pick his pocket. You can convince him of most anything. And that's what we saw. And when we think about the 60s, many of the people who were demonstrating and protesting in the street were young. Those people who ran up into the Capitol, they were middle-aged and elderly, running up into the Capitol, attacking. So this is not young people who don't understand what they're doing, who just got here. Those were people's mothers and grandmothers and fathers running up into the building to overthrow the government's business. So I try to understand, and I always think about it, and I'm going to stop in a minute, but I always think about the media's role in this, because having been in the media, you know, for 40 years, I see how we create heroes and we create goats and we create people that people think are not worthy. You know what I'm saying? So therefore, you can feel free to hate them. And this some of what is different about now in the 60s is I think that in the 60s, it was mainly us, Black people. And today you see more woke white people. But for all the woke white people, their grandmothers and fathers are insane. I mean, many of those kids, one of those women I saw the other day, her father is a QAnon, and she's out marching for Black Lives Matter. How does that happen in the same family? You know what I'm saying? So Baldwin was talking to us, but so did Du Bois talk to us. And our scholars keep talking to us, and we're not listening. You know, and it's very upsetting. And this pretense of ignorance in 2021 is really a pretense, because you know better. And you keep repeating the same cycle. And usually when the cycle repeats itself, it's like white people have this meltdown that they think that us getting something is going to rob them of something. You got to have the whole pie. You can't share the pie. And that's a part of the problem.
AUKRAM?
Yeah. Well, as far as I'm concerned, the fire started when our ancestors was come in trade, right? Which was common. You know, you had different people, different places come and trade goods and what have you. And then the next thing you know, they're into human trafficking. So when we talk about the fire started way back then. And the fire was started by a lie. All right. The lie was that we were inferior. All right. And the reason why they had to say we were inferior is to justify slavery. So we have to start from the beginning and unpack it from there, right? In terms of what we're up against. And what we're up against is not only the fire that's caused by external forces, but also the fire within us, you know, because when we talk about racism, all right, we have the overt racism, but it's the internalized racism is killing us as well. And we need to address that. You know, I grew up in Philadelphia, all right, and you use 1968 as a point of reference. Well, I grew up in Philadelphia. I was very much aware of the Black Power Conference that took place there in September of 1968. And a lot, this is 2 years after Stokely in 1966 had coined the phrase and, you know, basically had moved the agenda from civil rights to Black power. But I was not an activist at the time, but I was impacted by that. All right. And when I went on to school in Boston, those seeds that had been planted from me being exposed to that through media and through people in the street and what have you grew. And I became an activist. I was one of the co-founders of the National Black Student Association. All right. Our motto was educate, agitate, and organize. All right. So if you look at what's happening today, the same things happening. All right. The same issues that we were organizing around then are the same issues that's happening today. Economic equality, educational equity, improving living conditions in our community, ending police brutality. Those are all issues that we were fighting for at the time, and we're still fighting for them today. All right. But I really urge people is if we're going to talk about educating or reaching out to the white community, they first have to understand the lie, the original lie. All right. In terms of who we are as a people. All right. And we also need to understand who we are as a people. And I think that we could begin from there.
Betty, let's talk about a little bit here the role of, I don't know if we're going to say just the media, but of this digital world that we live in right now. So much of this ignorance that you speak of, white ignorance, is willful, chosen ignorance through isolation in an echo chamber of a digital world, could be a physical world as well, to where people convince themselves of certain ideologies and become radicalized. That's what we saw on January 6th, in my view. On the opposite side of that, we've got demographics that are shrinking this country's white majority. What happens when those two collide together?
Well, I think you got what you got January the 6th is what you get, particularly when the lie gets told. When you are denying something as basic as a pandemic, something that is actually killing people all around you, and you deny. When President Trump's press secretary said there's an alternate facts, that was the beginning of this new generation of the lie. Alternate facts. Either it's a fact or it's not a fact. Like I always ask people when I was in the newsroom, and I would always say, we wanted, what is the upside of the Holocaust? Tell me the other side of that story. Tell me the other side of the story about slavery. You are obliged to say something is wrong. This is wrong. And I think that what happened is that because I think white America has not even dealt with white privilege, it thinks that anything that anybody else gets is going to oppress them, as somebody said. They feel oppressed because somebody else is going to get something, and they don't even understand that they are poor. That many of them who are marching and talking about they don't like black people, they are worse off than we are. And they don't even see the ability to coalesce around the issues. I don't care if you don't want to live next door to me. I'm cool. But what it is that I want to be able to have access. And so I think, like I said, I think that white people have these meltdowns. And when you get people who are like Trump or McCarthy, there's always somebody, there's always that person to come there to stir that up in there that says that they get it. Because there was another riot here in Louisville in 1855, I think it was. And that was when the Germans and the Italians were attacked by the Protestants in this city, fostered by, in large part, the guy who was the head of the newspaper that preceded the Courier Journal. So a lot of these people who are the descendants of immigrants forget that they used to be us, that they down. They burned the people in the streets. And that's because they were Catholic and because they were immigrants. And here now we got the Mexicans. I'm telling you, it's a cycle. And all it takes is people in the media or wherever to stoke the fires. Donald Trump got elected because a lot of people in the media thought he was entertaining. They thought he was entertaining, including Joe Scarborough and some of the ones that came after him now. They used to have him on there all the time, saying anything. And they allowed that to happen. And so they let an entertainer get in there, and somebody that already had this history of hatred for black people, and made him as if he was the joke. He is not funny. There is nothing funny when your life is on the line. So I'm just saying to you, I think that before there was a Trump and all of that, Trump is really the end of a long succession of this. When Ronald Reagan went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, to kick off his campaign where the the 3 civil rights workers had been killed. He was making a statement to white people. Ronald Reagan talks about the city on the hill. He's a part of this whole conspiracy against our people. So we can't vote. Now they're working again to figure out new ways to keep Black people from the ballot. All across the country, this is now a thing. But yet, even in Kentucky, I know somebody is voting for Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell. Somebody that I know. I'm saying that when you don't even have the interests of your constituents at hand, people here who need stimulus, for example, people here who need the government's help that are not getting it because our senators are standing in the way. Does that make sense? So if there's anybody that doesn't vote in their own self-interest, you get what you deserve. And I don't just mean that it's just about the vote, but I'm just saying to you, James Baldwin knew it, Du Bois knew it, Carter G. Woodson knew it. We've been telling it, Ricky Jones know it, AUKRAM knows it. It's in the books, it's in the library, it's in the thing. And it's never gonna change. And don't forget, let me just say this, that uprising here in Louisville in 68 started from what? It was partly about Dr. King, but it was also because a white police officer got off with brutalizing a Black man. So here we are now, same thing, police brutality. And there's been this big sort of debate about what do we do about the police? The police are there supposedly to protect the people, but almost all of these situations, you see it comes from police being abusing their power and killing people in the streets. That is the deal. And if we don't fix that, it's going to keep happening, and we're going to keep having more Breonna Taylors and more George Floyds because the cops have no responsibility when they kill us. Now, I know I'm going all over the place, but
right.
curious.
We'll come back to 68 here in a minute. Before we do that, Dr. Jones, are we seeing the end of the gasping of the old isolated white racist men? Or is this going to be a journey that goes on for decades and decades? I mean, the demographics of our country are changing dramatically. That's what gives me hope. Am I naive?
I think there are two things to consider. One bad, one good. I'll go with the bad first. The bad thing is the white hegemony, white supremacy does not stay static. It doesn't manifest itself in the same way all the time, right? So you can't get away with a Dred Scott v. Sanford type of decision that the Supreme Court renders in the 1850s and says, Black men have no rights that whites are bound to respect. You can't say that. You got to do it a little bit differently. And that's why we see some of the political machinations that we see around the country and some of the social upheaval. So it shifts. It's fluid, right? That it's not some type of static block. And so white supremacy is still alive, but it's different. That's the bad. And if we don't understand that socially, politically, economically, and not just nationally, but internationally, then we're kind of missing the point. Here's the good. I think you're right, Mayor, that as for all the criticism that young people endure in this city, in the state, and in the country, I think a good percentage of them do approach race differently than we Gen Xers or the baby boomers before us. It's not as simple as, the older folk are going to die out and racism is going to go away, because we still do have some, rather young folk that are reaffirming that type of paradigm. But I think the approach is different and there is hope. And I think, demography doesn't lie. Demography is destiny. When you look at this country, it is becoming less white. And I truly believe that that's why we see certain sectors of the white community who are, really caught up in this spasm right now because they see, dominance as their birthright, and they see that threatened as the numbers shift. So that's the good news and the bad news. I think we have to work diligently to arm our young people, to not just educate them, about race, but about history and all of these things, so that they can build a new and better world. But I think there's some very positive possibilities on the horizon.
So let's go back to 1968 AUKRAM, and Betty referred to it earlier. Dr. King had been assassinated weeks before. Louisville was on edge. and there was a decision going to be made about a white police officer and whether or not he was going to be able to come back on the police force. Can you set the stage for us in 1968, what took place then?
Well, I'm not from here, so I don't know all the details. And I also make a slight correction. I am I'm a student of history of Louisville, and I've learned quite a bit about Louisville and its glorious history. It is just fascinating, the things that I have learned. I would say that the whole issue about the police is not only here in Louisville, but it was in Philadelphia, it was in Boston. I was involved in countless protests against police brutality by the Boston Police Department. And I'm talking about the early 70s, 70 to 75. I think that a year didn't go by that we didn't have at least 2 or 3 protests about police brutality against young people or murders in that case. But I think that what we also need to kind of understand is that when you conjugate this into its common denominator, it really comes down to when we talk about Black power, all right? All right, so let me go back. When I talked about Stokely, all right? Stokely changed the Freedom Now call from the civil rights movement to Black power, all right? It created a shift from the civil rights movement. And if you look at what's happening today in terms of Black Lives Matter, the same kind of thing has happened. Where I'm kind of concerned is whether we'll use that to divide us, all right? Because in the 60s, the issue of civil rights and Black power, that was used to, in many ways, to put a wedge between us. And then you had COINTELPRO come in and basically exaggerate that whole situation. So as we start to talk about these things to younger generations, we need to let them know, all right, that the purpose of this thing is first to have community control, right? We don't want government interference in what we do. And when I say interference, I'm talking about if you take Louisville, for instance, you had a community here, Walnut Street, where the center is located on Muhammad Ali Boulevard. It was a thriving community, and it was basically decimated because of urban, I call it rural, I think there's a video that's out there that shows the mayor actually talking about the racist move to get rid of that community. Now, here, that community was 5 blocks away from an area that they could not go shop, 4th Street, all right? They had everything they needed right there on Walnut Street. When Walnut was decimated, now what they're saying is, oh, you can go shop where we shop. You don't need to, have that. Okay. So my thing is that we need to understand the dichotomies, the history that we've been up against. And we can build our communities if we're left alone. We need assistance. We need, support. We need allies. All those things are important, all right? But at the end of the day, we have the skill base, the skill set within our communities, all right, to build our communities. It would bring tremendous pride to our communities. You see other communities developing with no interference whatsoever. But when we try to do something, there's interference. I'm not making this up. We can go to, Wall Street in Oklahoma. We go to Florida, Rosewood, all right? And as I just said, we can go to Walnut Street. These communities were destroyed because of the success of our people. So again, we need to have that conversation. One other thing I just wanted to say, Mayor, about media. I have a saying. I like philosophy, and one of my favorite is Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, which was 7,000 years ago. And there's a quote in there that says, "He who controls the image controls the mind." And what I see happening, and this has been part of my research, is we don't control our image. When we're talking about Africans, African Americans, right? And that is part of our struggle and our dilemma and our challenge. And the other part of that is that white people, again, have ingested the lie. You know, look at, I'll give you one quick example. Look at the images that were launched at Barack Obama when he became president. I mean, some of the old stereotypical images just came out of, the melons and the apes and things like that. Okay. Now, if you go back, I was in Boston. There was a time in Boston, in the Boston Commons, it said no Irish or dog allowed. Okay. And, Irish were looked at and looked down on. Mayor Hurley became mayor while he was in jail. That's how powerful the Irish were. Once he got office and once the Irish started taking over municipalities across this country, those stereotypes dropped, right? They ceased, all right? We've been involved in running municipalities for years, but yet they continue to persist. I really think that we need to revamp our educational system and root out a lot of these images, because these are the images that particularly perpetuate the lie that I've been talking about. And this is insidious situation right now, is that we have to root out the lie.
Well, and you talk about ignorance here, and Betty, you spoke earlier about Bloody Monday in Louisville in 1855, when the German and Irish Catholics, so those are my people, probably about a third of Louisville is German and Irish Catholics, were pushed into the church that was burned to the ground with them in it. And then out of that came, what was the party called? The Know Nothing Party.
Right.
Because they were willfully ignorant at the time as well. So it's just this cycle that repeats. But as you all said far more eloquently and naturally than me.
But I think here's the difference. The difference is that the Irish, Germans, all of them eventually became white people. They were able to sort of blend in. Folks could change their names, take the sound out of it. I understand that Trump's name is Dumpf. That he's German, that his father, his family's from Germany. We don't have that ability to meld in and to just change our names and stuff. We are very visible in who we are. But I think that too many people of those nationalities don't tell their children their own history. Because once they became white people, you know what I'm saying, white people, once they became white people, 1-2 generations off that boat, they became a part of the issue and they came after us. You see, because we were visible. So, it's very interesting that white people got to define who was white. So if you were black, no matter how white you were, they said it was one drop. So they have really set the stage for their own demise, because now we've got, my family looks like the United Nations. My cousins look like white people, but they are not white people because one side of their family is black. So white people figured out how to decimate their own numbers. And I think they'll start claiming mixed people soon as white people so that they can build the numbers up. Because my David was a Puerto Rican, but on his birth certificate, as black as he was listed as white. and on his death certificate listed as white. So I'm just saying that white people get to decide who's white. And once those immigrants decided that they were white people, then they had to find somebody else to look down on, and they were only one generation from being treated horribly themselves. So it's just a very interesting thing. Like, if you let me in the door, the goal is to be white people. That's the goal. That's the gold standard. And then when I get to be a white person, I can look down on you. I can keep you from being in the labor unions. I can keep you out of the police department. I can do that. I have that power. And isn't that interesting that it only took like one generation for them to become white people? I grew up with a bunch of Italians in New York. I never thought of them as white people. And then at some point they became white people. They were Italians, they were Jews, they were Germans, but they became white people. And when they became white people, there were more white people to then come after the people of color.
Well, my wife is a daughter of Greek refugees, and some of her cousins in one generation are now Trump followers. And she reminds them, you were despised just one generation ago.
And I have Greek cousins. My cousin she went to Greece. She went to a little private school. She went to Greece, and all her Greek relatives came to meet her because, her grandfather was Greek. So we have all of that. But I'm saying it's that idea of becoming white people. It's something about that gets people where they want to be that more than anything.
Well, I think and I hope that's changed. You wanted to bring it in, AUKRAM.
There's a book that used to require reading when I taught in the School of Education at the university. It's called A Different Mirror by Ronald Takaki. All right. And it really does a good job, chapter by chapter, of looking at what happened with the Irish, what happened with the Italians, what happened with African Americans. Now, mind you, in the beginning, most of my class was white. I had maybe 2 or 3 black students, and many of them had an attitude in the beginning of, why are you having us read this book, But in the middle of the course, that shifted. And the anger towards me started to shift at, why didn't we learn this? Because many of them were from a particular ethnic group, all right, that they could identify with, and they had no idea that had happened, all right? So we start out talking about white privilege and start out talking about, black people. That's the reason why they were angry at me. But then when they started to read about what had happened with other groups, then they began to understand. Ronald Takaki, he was a Japanese scholar at the University of California, and he had a PhD, a doctorate degree in African and African American history. He caught a lot of flack because he was Japanese and he was pushing that. So I think that, again, I think the key is in education. We really have to start unpacking this, because the only way you're going to stamp out a lie is bringing in the truth. And right now, we need to really bombard our communities, our people, with, truthful information for them to utilize.
And Dr. Jones, are you seeing any progress in any curriculum, broad-scale curriculum, that is helpful to educate the broader population about these facts and truths we're talking about here? And what's it going to take for us just to embrace reality? I mean, what's the problem here?
Yeah. Broad scale, no. It hasn't happened yet. That doesn't mean that it won't happen. Mayor, I always say that, 2020 was a time for talking, when folks were saying, we see you, we hear you, we understand. And I think 2021, we'll see if there's going to be some walking to it, if people are going to actually make some changes. Whether that be at my university or the public school system here and across the country, where we can replicate some of these things, curriculum is incredibly important, from the K through 12 system into higher education, because we've done our children a woeful disservice up to this point. But some of that is remembering the history of how we functioned in this country too. You know, we tell these very nice stories about how, you know, Brown versus Board in 1954 destroyed Jim Crow, and it destroyed Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. But what people don't talk about is that in school systems all over this country, when they integrated and the segregated black schools were destroyed, white school systems fired the majority of the black teachers. In some systems, almost all of them. And so we had these black children learning along these diametrically opposed axes, and it was problematic. And the curricula were set up in such a way that it still reinforced white supremacy. So our children were leaving these systems where they had a built-in black inferiority complex and a white superiority complex, and neither one of them was real. You know, we even look, and Reverend Kevin Cosby tells this very true story all the time about the University of Louisville. So we see, you know, these things even here. You know, Louisville talks about how, you know, had the first Black Studies department in the South. That's great. You know, one of the first to integrate around because of the Day Law in Kentucky from 1904. Blacks and whites were not allowed to attend school together. In 1950, when the University of Louisville integrated, and it got rid of its black branch, which was Louisville Municipal College, another incarnation of Simmons. So when they integrated in 1950, what people don't talk about is they fired all the black professors and did something rather brutal, actually. Said to the black professors, only one of you will be allowed to come to the University of Louisville. You choose. So the black professors, all of them who knew all except one were going to lose their livelihoods here in the city, they drew straws. And Dr. Charles Parrish was the only black professor to go to the University of Louisville. So when you have that type of dearth of numbers, and even now, you know, we have less than 60 tenured and tenure track black professors at the University of Louisville. I'm not counting the part-time lecturers. I mean, the line faculty. And then when you get into upper administration where people are actually making decisions about curriculum and all of these things, it's just not there. And the same is true in JCPS. The same is true all around the country. So do we have wholesale curriculum changes right now? No, we don't. But the expertise isn't there either. And I'll say this in my last point. You can't teach what you don't know. Our white colleagues have come through the same school system that our children have come through. And I've had conversation with some high-level educators in this town, at my school and in the public school system. And their knowledge of American history where race is concerned on that landscape is absolutely woeful. So they can't put something together that they don't know, even if they're well-intentioned. So we have a lot of work to do.
We do, and I can tell you, and AUKRAM, you mentioned this, one of the things, you know, we commissioned a study on redlining in Louisville, because what I found time and time again is white people do not understand, let's say, why parts of the West End look the way they look. And in that, I used the Mayor Farnsley video. And Mayor Farnsley was commenting on urban renewal because it came before him. And this silly notion that by destroying buildings, you could keep people apart from each other. Or Harlan Bartholomew, the father, so-called father of modern American city planning, who used infrastructure to separate the predominantly white downtown from the encroaching black population. 9th Street in Louisville, or it could be a railroad line, it could be an interstate line, all of these things intentionally put forward. I bring that up, Ricky, Dr. Jones, because the white folks were like, oh, I understand now. They had no exposure to this reality. And for those that were halfway curious, it satisfied them and made them want to learn more because they had no clue, because none of that was presented to them when they were growing up.
Well, I was fascinated how many white people found their way to the West End to get the vaccine. They could find West 9th Street to get the vaccine.
Well, I think you make a serious historical point, though, Mayor, in that people have to understand that a lot that happened, you know, the majority of it, has been very intentional. You know,
exactly.
It's been deliberate. It's been planned. And I want to be clear, you know, I'm not one, you know, Mao said, only a fool unnecessarily turns friends into enemies. So there are white people out here of good conscience, and I'm not trying to turn them into enemies. I'm not trying to paint everybody with one broad brush. You know, there are people of good conscience. and they need to work to educate themselves. But that doesn't destroy the legacy, the reality, or the legacy of white supremacy and these very intentional things that have been done, and not to divide, that's a nice word, that have been done to absolutely oppress and dehumanize. And so we have to be very tuned into that, be very deliberate about our language, very deliberate about our studies, because only then can we create a situation where we can combat that. You know, if we don't do that, it's a problem. And that's particularly tough in a country that is in intellectual decline.
That's right.
We are an anti-intellectual country.
Ooh.
We know more about, you know, Kanye West than we do Cornel West. You know, it's an entertainment obsessed country where celebrity matters a whole lot more than substance across the racial divide. And so, again, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and my point is not to forgive anyone for their ignorance, but it's not like you can't understand these issues if you study the causes behind the issues.
Right.
It's necessary to change today so we have a better tomorrow.
Right. What I like to tell my students, to get intellectual for a second, this is a two-tier thing. There's ontology, which is the study of reality, where we just ask what, you know, what exists. But then the deeper level is epistemology, which asks what and why. How do you know what you think you know, right? How do you know what you think you know? We got to get into, you know, serious study about why things exist as they are before we can understand whether they're positive or negative, whether they need to be reinforced or dismantled. So that's very important.
Betty, are we just on a that keeps repeating, or do you see 68 and 2020 as the same thing? Do you see them totally different? Do you see some change? How do you reflect?
No, I see them as the root of it is the same. The manifestation of it. I think Ricky or AUKRAM, one of them said that the fact of the matter is that it's like some of the same stuff, but it's different. Like this generation, the way they're approaching it is different. You see more white allies, you know, with, you know, the young people that are in the street who would say her name. But I think the other thing is that when you see that these young people, many of them are studying things. They are students of Ricky Jones. A lot of those kids out there were Ricky Jones's students who are out there marching. A lot of them have been influenced by AUKRAM. So there are a lot of them who have a consciousness, a high consciousness that is higher. But I also think that Ricky said something about important that we understand that when we talk about Black history or trying to understand how things work, you have to understand something as basic as how they built the projects, where they built the projects. You know, the architecture is important. Some people might see that as unrelated. We have to understand anthropology. There are all of these different subjects that you don't have to call it necessarily studies. But when you understand that, say, Chestnut Street was named one thing when white people had one part of it, and then they changed the name to the other part. We have to see how stuff is named. We have to watch when the story is about poverty. Who do they choose to interview for the story? You know, it's not just one thing. You have to understand housing. You have to understand how all of those things work. And so there are young people. Let me tell you, my hope comes from some of the young people that I know. My hope comes from those kids that are going to be running around in that building that Sadiqa Reynolds just got, that track. That will be more than just a track for them to run around, but will be a place for education and learning. All of the things that are going on, because they have to see themselves. How does this work in sports? I interviewed James McBride, the writer and my classmate. And one thing he said to me was he took a class with John Carlos. And when he came out of that class and he was one of the, you know, with the fist at the Olympics, he never looked at sports the same way. You got to, what's his name, who did $1 Million Slaves, about the athletes. Ricky, you know who I'm talking about, my friend. Used to be at the time. Bill Rhoden. All of this stuff, the sports, the architecture, all of this stuff is connected. All of that talk about Black people couldn't be quarterbacks. This, all of that thing is related to race. And so it's not just one thing. And so when Ricky says that, you know more about Kanye West than you know about Cornel West, you know what I'm saying? Or what somebody is doing. Part of this is that how do we get young people to look at the totality and what they're caught up in? That you're not just running up and down with a ball. You know what I'm saying? It's not just about you getting your degree. I don't care if you're studying theology, anthropology, all of it has some kind of aspect to it that comes out of the racial divide in this country. Even to how they built the projects, what they looked like, where they put them, how they isolated people. All of that was public policy. And so when they're having those debates that seem like they are boring, we need to pay attention to what they're talking about on C-SPAN, because those public policies, what the Metro Council is doing, what you do, all of those public policies impact our lives.
That's right.
You see, and we can't just look at it in isolation. So we have to really see, I think, the full picture. And much of the stuff that I learned, I did not learn it because my mother went to a segregated school and she learned, about the poets. She told me about Langston Hughes and all of the different poets and stuff, because in her all black school, she learned that. She sang Lift Every Voice and Sing. You know what I'm saying? In school with the national anthem. Most of us are still stumbling over the words. So I'm just saying that it's in the music, it's in the culture, it's in every aspect of our lives. And if we can take and have people say, we don't all have to be Ricky Jones, but if you're a musician, you need to understand the roots of that music. You need to understand who did what, you know what I'm saying? And so much of what people do, they act like nothing happened before. So you got to have what happened before and build on it. And that's what I think some of these young people that I'm so proud of them today, many of them, they are building on what happened before. They saw what happened to Stokely and to Rap, and they know about COINTELPRO. But we have to let them get the word out to even talk to their generation when they won't listen to me, but they might listen to somebody from their own generation that knows. So I know I'm going on too long, but I'm sorry.
AUKRAM, give us some closing words, and then Dr. Jones, I'm going to ask you to wrap this thing up, buddy.
Where do you start?
I'm sorry.
No. I'm
muting myself.
I could listen to you all night, because you running it, you laying it down. First thing I want to say is, there's always this saying that goes around the Black community about that is disintegration. That he basically lose one for bringing me here to Louisville. He told me a story once about because his father worked at and so he was out there with the Young family, Whitney Young, sitting on the porch the day that the Civil Rights Bill was signed. And Whitney said to Bernard, all right, I think we're making a mistake. Okay. And what I take from that is that we lost some of who we were in so-called fight to integrate. And I really feel like we need to, and again, what I'm putting forth here is that all my life, not all my life, but most of my life, I've worked in education. The last, I would say 20 years, I spent a lot of time talking to white people about this stuff. And I decided that enough be that I needed to come into my community and work in my community. And so the things that I'm saying tonight is that we as a people need to come together and start addressing this issue. White people need to get it together, but white people need to be teaching white people that. People that already good, meaning people who know what's going on, know what's happening, they need to get in the white community and start educating their people, all right? My people need me. My people need Ricky. My people need, all of us to come out and talk to them, work with them, all right, so that we can move our agendas forward. I'll leave it at that. I think that this is a really good conversation. I would urge that we find a way to do this on a regular basis and not just relegate it to Black History Month, that it should be an ongoing conversation. I think that the conversation should generate some kind of bibliography or some textual information that people can go back and actually study, because we are in a protracted struggle and we have to continue to educate ourselves. I have to educate myself. We all have to educate ourselves.
Dr. Jones, we've covered a lot of territory here tonight. What are our themes and what's your homework assignment for us?
Well, I think it's a thought assignment, good Mayor. I think what my dear brother AUKRAM is expressing is what we see as a growing level of frustration in Black communities across the country, and a loss of faith that white communities are going to, in good conscience, work to build a better equal world as far as race is concerned. And so a lot of our people, and I'm hearing this argument more and more and more, that the idea of integration and living peacefully and humanely with white Americans is a lost cause, so we have to figure out another approach to this. I will hope, and I'm maintaining some hope, that that is not the road that we're going to stay on. I'm still a believer in the possibilities of America, that we can have some type of reconciliation. Truth has to come first, and it's going to be painful. But we can have some type of reconciliation where we will not retreat to segregated communities to survive, to maintain the humanity of our children, to maintain our own sanity. There is no historical proof that I'm right about that, I will admit, but I'm hoping that there's something that can happen where we can, change the course that we're on. Finally, I'll say this, Mayor, to you personally. I know you've had struggles around this issue over the last year, but I've known you even before this year, and I would encourage everybody to think about this. I think we all owe one another some grace, because none of us are perfect. We all gonna make mistakes. And as my grandmother, God rest her soul, said, we all need too much forgiveness not to grant it to others. And none of us should be judged by our worst day, our worst week, our worst month, or our worst year. So I appreciate you bringing this together in the work that you're trying to do around this. My model of a mayor is Maynard Jackson. He's the first mayor I remember who was elected in Atlanta, first Black mayor of Atlanta in 1973, who was able to change the course of that city. And I hope that Louisville will have mayors like that, no matter what their race. So hopefully this will spur some conversations with folks, some very serious conversations, not surface. And again, they can be painful, but that pain and that conflict could birth something more decent, just, humane, and true. So hopefully this is the start, not considered the end. So thank you, Betty, for hanging out tonight. Thank you, AUKRAM. It's always good to see you. And thank you, Mayor, for convening it.
Well, thanks to our guests here. Y'all are wonderful Americans and great Louisvillians. We appreciate your wonderful job as citizens. And Kendall Boyd, thank you for bringing us together as our city's Chief Equity Officer. And I'll turn it back over to you for the final word.
Well, I wish we had another hour. This was like a kitchen table discussion. Sometimes these ugly conversations happen at the dinner table. But again, I want to thank our guests for the great insight. We've got a lot of work to do in our community to prevent the fire next time. But I have all the confidence with leadership that I see here on the screen right now that we can do this. We just have to be amenable to listening to each other and being intentional about deconstructing systemic and institutional racism. Mayor, thank you again for your time and leading this discussion. And yes, we will have many more discussions like this outside of Black History Month. That's what Lean Into Louisville is all about. You have my pledge to that. So thank you, everybody. Please stay safe, stay healthy. It's starting to warm up out there, so enjoy some of the weather. God bless you. Have a great night. Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.